This lunar eclipse is part of a whole series of eclipses that started last September. This is Saturn, girl. And we have just entered eclipse season 2025. Now, my previous video from yesterday was all about the general meaning of eclipses and this eclipse phase. For more information on that and what it means for you and what the eclipse cycle even is, go watch my previous video because that stuff is really, really important. But in this video, we're going to talk about this particular lunar eclipse in Virgo that's happening on Friday, March 14th or 13th. It depends on where you are, okay? It's going to happen at the wee hours of the morning on the 14th or the very, very late hours on the 13th, okay? Now, this lunar eclipse is part of a whole series of eclipses that started last September, okay? Back in September of 2024, I think it was the 17th, we had a lunar eclipse in Pisces. Now, what was important about that? Well, it was the first eclipse of this series of eclipses. And as you might recall from the previous video, lunar eclipses are supercharged big endings. Yes? And we have to appreciate this within the greater context of other transits. Yes. Now remember, Saturn has been touring through Pisces since March of 2023. When Saturn goes through a particular sign, it's also going through a particular whole sign house in our charts. In this case, Pisces. And that whole sign house will get depressed by Saturn and will get strained. We'll feel confinement. We will feel exile. And we'll feel like we just can't measure up in that area of life. We keep dealing with hopefully surmountable challenges, but sometimes they feel insurmountable, don't they? Now, why is that so important in this particular case? Well, it's because Saturn has been touring Pisces, and the nodes have just entered Pisces and Virgo, departing Aries and Libra. So, the previous lunar eclipse back in September happened before the nodes changed signs. So it indicated a prelude to the Saturnian tests that we've been challenged on this whole time. It's almost as if the lunar eclipse was bringing to a close the challenges and trials of Saturn in Pisces and giving us a prelude of what it looks like to go through those challenges, to be victorious, or to complete something that you've been leaving undone since March of 2023. And of course, that's determined by your particular rising sign. And we'll go through some horoscopes at the end of this video, so make sure you watch until the end. But first, I want to talk about the context of these lunar eclipses within this greater eclipse season. Now, as I said, the lunar eclipse back in September was particularly important because it represented a close, or at least the prelude to a close, of that chapter of life. Saturn has been forcing us to face things that we haven't dealt with before. Of course, indicated by that whole sign house Pisces is for you. The lunar eclipse indicated the way ahead. It was sort of like a rude awakening, shaking us up from a hangover and telling us, yo, this is how you have to get back on track. Now it's up to us whether we do it or not, whether we recognize the opportunity to overcome these blind spots in our lives and hopefully bring order, right? Saturn loves order. Saturn loves boundaries. Bring order to that area of life that we've probably let go by the wayside. Now, we're being challenged in the opposite sign, Virgo, and the opposite whole sign house. What's interesting to note is that the lunar eclipse back in September was relatively conjunct Saturn. They were about 10 degrees away, the moon and Saturn in Pisces. So that was the Saturn eclipse. And what does that mean? Well, it means that even though the eclipse might indicate a new path or new abundance or a new direction, Saturn is sitting on top of it. And it's going to continue making things challenging. There may be a renewed sense of abundance, perhaps, or optimism, or resolve to press on. However, you will still be having to do it through the drudgery, right? Trudging through that sense of defeat, yes, that Saturn can engender. And so the key here is not to get caught in the slough of despond, right? If you've seen the movie The Never-Ending Story, remember when Artex, the horse, is sinking into the swamps of sadness? And Atreyu's like, Artex! Artex! This is what we're dealing with. Do not sink into the swamps of sadness, you see. Now, whereas the last lunar eclipse in September represented the beginning of the end of Saturn's transit through Pisces, this lunar eclipse represents the close of a previous condition, right? Having to do with the whole sign house Virgo is for you. Now, in that case, too, there were things bubbling up under the surface, which you probably weren't aware of. And this lunar eclipse will probably make you painfully aware of them, even if you experience positive effects. Similar to the last eclipse, this is also a Saturn eclipse, because Saturn will be very closely conjunct the moon, right? This is also a Saturn eclipse because Saturn will be closely opposite the moon and closely conjunct the sun in Pisces, right? The moon will be in Virgo. So this eclipse also has a decidedly Saturnian character. It represents new lessons and challenges that will be popping up related to that whole sign house the Virgo is for you. And what it's doing is clearing away a bunch of nonsense that will have to be revived and revitalized following the solar eclipse in Virgo that happens towards the end of September. I believe it's September 21st. And that will represent a whole new beginning in that area of life. And once again, like I said, it will be a shakeup because Chris Brennan, the famous astrologer, once said, eclipses bring the best and the worst events of our lives. I mean, we have them every year. I think that's a little dramatic, but they are pretty significant events. If you want to go back and see what eclipses are, check out my previous video where I explain them, both astronomically and astrologically. Anyway, so this is a very important lunar eclipse because it represents a prelude to the lessons we're going to have to learn following the solar eclipse in September. Now, Saturn is also getting ready to change signs from Pisces to Aries, which is really interesting because the lunar nodes have just changed signs back in January from Aries Libra to Pisces Virgo. Yes. Now, when the lunar nodes change signs, it represents the beginning of a whole new eclipse phase within the greater 18.6-year eclipse cycle. So what does this phase mean for you? We'll talk about it just a minute in your horoscopes. But before we get to that, we have to talk about several things within the context of this that we need to be aware of. It's almost as if Saturn and the North Node are switching places, yes, as Saturn goes into Aries. I think that's going to be at the end of May. Okay, but it's around the end of May, late spring, early summer, whatever it is. So it's like they're changing signs. Now, the North Node, if you remember from my previous video, increases things, while the South Node decreases things. So the whole sign house that Aries is for you has been experiencing an amplification, perhaps even a sense of abundance, right? North Node. and an emphasized sense of importance from the last eclipse cycle. You may have seen big new beginnings in the whole sign house that Aries is for you. For example, in my life, it was Aries in the 3rd house, right, of communication and siblings and family. But it was ultimately communication that was highlighted for me. I started doing live streaming more frequently. I started doing more videos and more media, more content creation. All this stuff of the 3rd house. Now, the North Node moving into Pisces is my 2nd house. Meanwhile, Saturn moving into Aries is also my 3rd house. So we can see that switching of the guard, right? Saturn going into Aries while the North Node left Aries, as representing Saturn's tests and trials upon that area of life. Whereas the North Node may have increased things and brought a greater sense of abundance or whatever, or amplification. Our voices got louder in the case of the 3rd house, right? In the case of the 1st house, we got larger than life. I don't mean, belly-wise. I mean, we got a bigger sort of presence, right? But then Saturn comes in and depresses all that and sits on that sense of accomplishment that the North Node brought. Saturn sort of saying, oh yeah, you thought you were doing good here? Well, let's see how good you did. So Saturn is essentially testing the foundation upon which we built our structure. It's like when they test bridges, to see how well they'll hold up. And that's what Saturn's doing to us in Aries as she enters a brand new whole sign house in our charts. As we get to horoscopes, we're going to focus on this particular lunar eclipse and what it means, especially within the greater eclipse cycle and the changing of the nodes. But we can't do that without an appreciation of Saturn and how Saturn relates to all these eclipses we've just experienced and are going to experience. And remember, Saturn is protracted challenges, whereas Mars just start things rather quickly. Saturn carries them on. But also the rewards of Saturn are even more so than the rewards of Mars, because they brought us through extreme difficulties and challenges. And hopefully, if you've used the opportunity and internalized the lesson and made practical value and use of it in your daily life, you will see your life take on a greater sense of livingness. You'll see your life demonstrate a greater self-awareness. And you'll see yourself accomplishing that which you wished you had. You'll be more in line with your dharma or your will or your path in life. Again, so much of astrology is just fated because life is mostly fated. Things just happen to us that we can't control, but we get the choice and the opportunity within the moment to pursue the most harmonious direction for our goals. Now, let's talk about horoscopes in the midst of this. So we're going to pull up the fun chart here. Let's see here. We're just going to lift this up. Lift me up, Lord, every day. I think that's Dave Matthews Band. I don't even like Dave Matthews Band, but it was a good song. Lift me up, Lord, every day. Okay. Well, let's start with Aries Rising. Okay. And we'll talk more about this eclipse in particular as we go through each sign. Aries. Aries. Like I said, we can't really talk about the meaning of these eclipses without talking about what Saturn has been doing in these houses as well in your chart. Okay. So for Aries Rising, that means Saturn has been touring your 12th house. When Saturn tours our 12th house, we have a greater sense of exile, of being alone, loneliness, facing mental health challenges, and self-destructive behavior. In my case, I was getting divorced. I had to leave my home. I very literally went into exile. I was living with friends out in the sticks, sort of removed from city life. Yeah. We didn't even have a dryer. Like, I had to hang my clothes up, I call that a limited hangout. Boom, boom. Anyway. So it's a very depressing time. Now, the lunar eclipse back in September of last year should have indicated, remember, it was in Pisces, your 12th house, it should have indicated, pointing out these issues to you that you haven't been paying attention to. Maybe you had been engaged in self-destructive behavior. Maybe you had been combating, drugs or alcohol or mental health issues. Yes? Now, the prelude that the lunar eclipse should have brought you last year is that you had to start dealing with your mental health stuff, your self-destructive behavior. And hopefully, despite all the difficulty and the challenges, you notice that this wasn't serving you. Like I said, it's like waking up from a hangover. And it's like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that last night. Ugh, this is not helping me. I had to call out to work, and I missed this, and I missed that. And you start to see that you've let your life unravel. Now, the lunar eclipse coming up, right, in Virgo, yes, in Virgo, represents that the opposite house, the 6th house, having to do with your health, right, your work, your routine, your obligations, right, even animals and pets, and injuries, illnesses, all that sort of stuff, that this is all of a sudden coming into focus, right? It's all of a sudden coming into focus. And so what happens here? You may experience an injury. You may experience an illness. Yeah. You may experience a conflict with a coworker. But it will be something that was connected to what you experienced in September in Pisces. However, the Virgo lunar eclipse represents something that was a blind spot that you didn't see before, just like the previous one did. And this lunar eclipse is bringing that blindness to a close. So, whatever happens here with regards to your 6th house, that is health, enemies, injuries, and illnesses, will be the area of life in this September 2025 where you experience a new beginning. And that means typically starting from square one, you see. And this eclipse phase, you have to remember, Aries Rising, is called the cocoon phase. So you've just come out of the Aries Libra phase in which your 1st and 7th house were being highlighted, your identity and your relationships, right? And how we experience ourselves affects how we experience others. And how we experience others affects how we relate to ourselves. You understand? So this change represents bringing all those challenges, conflicts, and realizations into yourself because they might not make sense yet. And this phase is about making sense of them. You might find yourself a bit more isolated, which is very characteristic of Saturn in the 12th house. So just be aware of that. You're being prompted to address your sense of exile, to bring yourself back into reality, back to reality. Oh, the ghost rabbit. I don't know, that's Eminem, you know what I mean? Snap back to reality. Oh, this ghost rabbit. I don't know the lyrics, but you know what I'm saying. It represents facing reality and coming out of the fog of the 12th house, which oftentimes brings conflicts, 6th house, dealing with enemies, 6th house, as well as your injuries, illnesses, and obligations. Okay? So just be aware of, oops, I should probably go back to Aries really quick to talk about the significations of the final solar eclipse in Aries at the end of this month. I believe it's the 29th of March. So back to Aries Rising really quickly. I'm so sorry, Taurus. Back to Aries Rising really quickly. This final solar eclipse will be in your 1st house. And that's a complete new beginning in your sense of self. But you see, you've already been going through these transformations in your identity, in your body and your sense of who you are over the past year and a half. And this represents the close, the final metamorphosis. Hopefully, you found yourself a bit more aligned with your sense of purpose, with who you are, with your basic sense of essence. Essence, our soul, our mind, body, and spirit are in the first house. So not only have you been going through bodily changes, but also in your mind, in how you experience yourself. So remember, this is the final one. And when Saturn comes into your first house to depress that, it's going to test your sense of confidence, your sense of resolve, and your sense of identity. How well have you put the foundations under yourself? Will you crumble under your own weight, under your own unawareness of yourself? Or have you cultivated that sense of direction and that sense of purpose, meaning, and motivation? Because this should represent what drives you, what drives your sense of direction, what drives your life, and what drives your path. Remember, Dharma is like your duty this life. Okay? And it's being emphasized here for you, Aries Rising. Take those lessons and press on. Okay? Now we're going to move on to Taurus. God, these are going to be so long. That's okay. So for Taurus Rising, as I said, we're leaving the cocoon phase, right? The 12th and 6th house thing. And we're entering the light of day phase, yes? The 11th and 5th house. Now, Saturn has been going through your 11th house, Pisces, right? Since 2023. And that oftentimes challenges our connections, right? We start to feel cynical. Yeah, we start to feel a little depressed, right? We feel a loneliness, right? We're strained from our previous connections. We might notice that relationships with friends are strained. Remember, the 11th house is hopes, wishes, friends, optimism, groups, supporters. Oftentimes we feel like we don't get support. People who may have patronized us before, whether it's our work, social media, or creation or creativity. Like for me, like my livelihood tends to be in the 11th house. And when I feel strain there, it's like, oh no. Also, it can feel like we get more conflicts through media, right? And through our creation and through our creativity. Sometimes we feel like we don't get inspiration. And we have to struggle to make anything work. Now, the wonderful thing about this lunar eclipse that happened in September was it should have showed you the way ahead. What in your life has been pushing people away? What in your life has made you more antagonistic with the groups or interests that you used to belong to? Because something has happened. Either you've had to cut out a group of friends, you've had to leave behind a certain mode of creative work, and therefore find new supporters. But either way, you should have been shown a glimpse of the way to reestablish connectivity and the way to achieve optimism again and a vision for the future. Now, this lunar eclipse coming up in just a couple of days is going to be in the opposite sign Virgo and your 5th house. Now, the 5th house, you may remember, has to do with pleasure, right? Sex, right? Enjoyment, and children. Yeah. It's all the stuff that we like doing, the 5th house. It's the pleasures of the flesh, right? And that's how we make children, isn't it? So there may be something coming to a close in the lives of your children. The other important thing to note is that the sense, perhaps, of not being able to have fun or lacking in zest in life. Remember, they always say the spice of life. And when you experience this transit, it can feel like life loses its flavor, right? And so this should represent bringing something to a close in that regard. Now, maybe there has been a problem with your children that you haven't been aware of. And this lunar eclipse brings it into focus. Like, oh no, I can't believe that's been going on. I can't believe my child has been bullied or bullying at school or whatever. Or maybe I've been involuntarily celibate. Not me, though. No. I mean, my body count qualifies as a genocide. Boom, boom. Shh. But you feel what I'm saying. This is about becoming aware of the lack of enjoyment in your life, or with the problem or challenge that your children are facing. And what you're being challenged here to do is to recognize it and to start to look ahead. Because once we go to that solar eclipse in Virgo in late September, you're going to see what you have to do, because that whole area of life is going to be smashed. It's going through a new beginning. That's the thing that we don't understand about beginnings. Beginnings are destructive. Beginnings can be traumatic. Beginnings can be challenging. They often are, because a beginning represents something previous coming to an end. Smash it. Smash it. Now, Saturn is going to enter Aries. The lunar nodes there probably meant that you've been working on all these hidden areas, right? These hidden areas of your life in the 12th house. Maybe you were addressing your mental health. Maybe you've gone into sobriety. Maybe you purposefully took yourself out of life for contemplation or spiritual pursuits. Saturn now is going to come in and push you into exile and test how well you cultivated the sense of certainty and what word do I want to use? Self-confidence, self-assuredness, that you can face what challenges happen. Because all these things are going to come back up. You're going to have events in your life that face you with challenges regarding the sense of exile, regarding the sense of seclusion, having to do with your mental health, your self-destructive tendencies, or perhaps addiction. So you will be tested. However, I'm very confident that the North Node moving through your 12th house had prepared you for this. Of course, if you have a night chart, it will be more difficult, meaning that you were born while it was dark. If you have a day chart, it will be a little bit easier, but easy is a relative word. So I want you to recognize that the challenges coming up in this eclipse phase also have a tinge of optimism, because this phase is about entering back into public life, about entering back into a sense of optimism and being able to look ahead and regain a sense of, of fun, right? Because like The Shining, remember the movie The Shining? All work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, right? We have to bear that in mind. So for you, my dear Taurus Rising, maintain a little bit of a sense of optimism. But if you do have children, make sure they get extra care at this time, because they've been dealing with something that you haven't been noticing, okay? But let's move on now to Gemini Rising. Now, I hope my partner is watching, because this is her. Actually, we also have another partner who has this too. I have so many Gemini Risings in my life. It's so interesting. I think I haven't. Anyway, I won't go into all that. But for Gemini Rising, you're exiting the light of day phase, right? And you've entered the manifestation phase. One of the, probably the biggest phase of the 18.6 year cycle. Because this is when stuff becomes real. Shit gets real for you. And with the 10th and 5th house, or sorry, the 10th and 4th house rather, this represents a complete change in your life direction. Whereas the 1st and 7th house has to do with the sense of essence, of motivation, of who you are. The 10th and 4th house phase represents where you're going and where you've come from. Yeah? The 4th house is our origins, our genealogy, our private lives, and our history. Also the home, well, the 10th house represents the life direction. It can be the career, it can be the vocation, it can be what you're publicly known for. But either way, it typically represents the direction that we are going in for this particular phase. You could notice, especially with Saturn having been passing through there, that the area of life regarding career had been depressed. Maybe you missed opportunities. Maybe you didn't get the promotion you wanted. Maybe you feel like you hit your glass ceiling and you can't move forward in your chosen career or life path. And what Saturn does here for us is redirect us onto new tracks, so to speak. Take us on a detour, a new road. And we find that what we wanted before totally changes. Because our values change. And we start to see a new path more in line with our values, don't we? Now this is quite important because the North Node is leaving Aries and your 11th house, where connectivity was reestablished. The sense of optimism was reestablished. Cultivating a sense of who you want to be and what you want your life to look like has been something that characterized the previous phase. Hopefully, you have a greater sense of pleasure and enjoyment and all these sorts of things. Hopefully, you feel like you've gotten more support. But Saturn coming into Aries at the end of May will test out those things. It will strain you. It will make you perhaps feel a bit depressed. And you'll have to go back and rely on that cultivated vision and sense of optimism to press on. Because Saturn's like, oh yeah, you want to go forward? Let's see how well you do. Oh yeah. And you have to show her that you've learned the lessons of the previous phase. Because this new sense of life direction is going to challenge you to find new supporters and a renewed sense of optimism in the path that you're now going in. Now, the lunar eclipse in just a few days will be in your 4th house. So something regarding your living situation, your private life, or your parents has been bubbling up under the surface, yes? Maybe your parents have had a difficult conflict or an illness or something that they've been having to deal with that you haven't been aware of. And you'll have to deal with the fallout of that as we pass the September solar eclipse, you see? Now, the solar eclipse in Aries, as I said, at the end of this month, is going to challenge you to develop a renewed sense of that optimism. You're gearing up to face the challenges that Saturn will bring. You are accumulating energy because this is the last hit of the Aries solar eclipses. It represents the final transformation of how you view the world and how you connect to others, how you get support, and hopefully your popularity. Yeah. Anyway, remember this lunar eclipse in Virgo is going to show you that something to do with your living situation is in flux and coming to a close. Or something to do with your parents. Or maybe your private life suddenly gets revealed. You have an embarrassing moment. And eventually, you have to deal with it after September. Oh, before we move on, I just want to say this is the most important phase. It really is. When I went through this phase, I quit my job of 20 years. And I moved out of state for the first time in my life. So it was a pretty significant change. I'm not saying that's necessarily what you're going to experience, but it will be a big marked change in your life direction, which also creates a change in your private life. Anyway, now let's move on. So for Cancer Rising, that is our Cancer Rising friends, you're departing that phase, the manifestation phase, that phase of the most activity of this cycle, where the most dramatic changes happen. Now you're entering what's called the reflection phase, which I've been in, and now I'm changing. But the reflection phase is where we sort of deal with what those accomplishments meant. What is it that you've achieved over the past year and a half? Have you experienced big changes in your life direction and perhaps in terms of your living situation? Well, now's the time where we sort of examine how we did, what those mean, how those have changed our values. Hopefully, pursuing a new life direction has shown you the weakness in what you previously believed in or considered to be a value. This is the phase that challenges our beliefs, our spiritual values, and how we learn. The ninth house is also higher education and wisdom, whereas the third house can be seen as sort of elementary primary school, right? Everything up to high school. But also our communication, our expression, short journeys, and people in our community. So the other side of this is how we express those values. And oftentimes our style of communication can totally change during this phase. Now, the lunar eclipse back in September showed you the holes in your belief system. Maybe you became disillusioned with your politics or your spirituality. In some way, your beliefs are changing. Now, the opposite house, the third house, where we're going to have this Virgo lunar eclipse in just a few days, represents a close to that style of expression that you've been that's been unconscious. Perhaps you've had a communication style, right? Like I talked about starting with streaming and doing astrology stuff, yada, 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 producing videos. Something about that communication style is changing for me, or did change rather, right? It changed from what I was doing before, mostly writing and stuff like that, into producing this content. Now, whatever's been happening for you, like I said, has been totally unconscious related to the third house. It could have to do with extended family, like siblings or uncles and aunts and all that sort of stuff. They may be having a particularly difficult time that you weren't aware of and that you may have to assist in addressing after the solar eclipse in September. But more likely is that it's been your mode of expression regarding your values. What's your style of communication now? Is that changing? Is there something you want to pursue? This is also media, right? What kind of media do you consume? You're speaking, you're writing, even education. Do you start to learn a new skill, learn a new path, learn a new philosophy? These are the things we experience in this ninth and third house phase. Sometimes our beliefs are deconstructed, right? Happened to me. I started rejecting everything I previously believed. And then the third house portion is how we disseminate that to others, how we connect on that to others. Because the ninth house things are useless when they just stay in your head. They're just theories. They don't have any value. They become practical through daily life expression and communicating them, don't they? So anyway, I just want to make sure I just want to make sure you understand that's emphasized here, okay? Now, the solar eclipse happening at the end of this month in Aries could very well reveal the path that you're supposed to be on. If you haven't seen it already, this is going to be, like I said, the final transformation in your life direction and your career. Okay? It might not be career. It could be what is most apparent about you, what you like to do, your pursuits. Could be a hobby, could be a passion. I know for me, it very literally was my career. So, career change. But let's move on. Excuse me, let's move on to Leo Rising. So for our Leo Rising friends, Saturn's been going through the 8th house, right? And we've just departed the 9th and 3rd house phase, right? Which has to do with beliefs and yada, 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 right? And all that sort of stuff. And now we've entered the phase, right? which I am too, for being Aquarius rising, of the 2nd and 8th house, which is death and taxes. It's quite fitting because for you, Leo rising, Saturn's been going through your 8th house since March of 2023. This can very literally bring a death in our families or someone important to us. But of course, that's the most extreme permutation. So I don't want you to get your knickers all twisted here. I don't want you to get your panties all up in a bunch over this. Sand in your naughty bits, you see. It can also be significant losses of money, of investment. It can represent forgiveness. It can represent facing fears in our lives, a fear that we've been carrying around with us. Oftentimes we get challenged to face it. Now, this can also be having to deal with theft or criminal things, right? Whereas the 9th house is the law, the 8th house is outlaw, that which is illegal. So you've been facing a transformation here. Now, the lunar eclipse that happened back in September should have brought sort of a climactic event that woke you up from this slumber, right? You may have been draining money or like bleeding money. I'm Aquarius rising, so this was my 2nd house. And yes, I was bleeding money for a long time. So this represents the phase where you try to put a band-aid on all this. Perhaps you've recognized your debt situation is unsustainable and you've been beginning to labor to fix it. Maybe you've had to recoup from a death. Maybe you've had to deal with the financial fallout of such. Either way, though, you're being prompted to face a sense of scarcity and uncertainty in your life regarding your finances. Now, it's very similar for Aquarius rising, but with the 8th house, it's particularly related to taxes, to debt, and to losses in investment. So just be aware that those things could be highlighted right now. The final solar eclipse in your 9th house signifies that you're developing a new value system and that the frosting is finally being placed on that value cake. So hopefully you've been recognizing that what you believed before doesn't serve you. And now you've moved into a new space of understanding, of worldview, and making practical value of it, hopefully. Because if you're not, then it's just a waste, It's just an idea. And if an idea isn't manifested or precipitated onto the physical plane, then what's the point? It doesn't do anything for anyone. But let's move on here. Let's move on to Virgo rising. Now, for our Virgo rising friends, you are in one of the most important phases of your life. That would be Virgo or Pisces rising, of course. Just like Gemini and Sagittarius rising are also in one of the most important phases of their lives. Now, for Virgo rising, you've just departed the 2nd and 8th house phase of the eclipse cycle, which is death and taxes, right? It's the finality of things. You're entering the beginning, once again, the 1st and 7th house phase. This is wild for you. Now, Saturn passing through the 7th house oftentimes does a couple of things. It can either A, strain our relationships, oftentimes because we become hyper-independent, and we feel a sense of distance from our partners, like, this isn't the person I married. Who is this person? I don't even recognize them. Well, the other thing Saturn in the 7th house can do is solidify commitments, right? Strengthen commitments. The problem is sometimes they happen to your detriment, meaning we can often feel imprisoned or confined by a deepening commitment. When I went through this phase, I moved in with an ex-spouse, and we deepened our commitment. Yes. That's an important thing to remember. Oh, I forgot to say the previous phase, the 8th house phase, when I went through that, That's when my ex-spouse and I started sharing our funds and having a joint bank account. That's also other people's money, you see? Sharing money, shared resources, okay? So I just want you to be aware of that. Now, the other thing here with the 7th house, like I said, a deepening commitment. So that lunar eclipse that happened back in September in your 7th house should have shown you the cracks in a current relationship. Or we also see competitions in the 7th house. So perhaps a rivalry deepened and took on added significance, right? And you became aware that this rivalry was going on. Or you became aware that the strain in relationships was going on. Or you became aware of a need for a deepening commitment. Like, yo, honey, are we getting married or what here? You know, like, you better or get off the pot, right? Or else I'm going to move on and find someone else who wants to get married and have babies and all that. You know what I mean? We become aware of the need for a deepening commitment. Now, what's even more about this lunar eclipse in a few days is that it's your first house. Yeah? It's your first house of identity, self, and mind and essence. It's the whole you, mind, body, and spirit. So something to do with your health, your body, or your sense of identity, your sense of dharma, your sense of motivation, your sense of purpose is coming to a close because you haven't been aware, right? You've let that stuff fall by the wayside. Perhaps you haven't been focused on the things that used to drive you and excite you before. Maybe you've been, floating along with the sense of purposelessness or a sense of being ungrounded or not having any particular motivation. That's coming to a close. And there will be an event coming up that will cause you to lose face, right? To perhaps feel disgrace in some way, right? To feel challenged on that sense of essence. And you will resolve between now and September to do something about it. You may see your sense of self deconstructed. You may have to face events where it's like, oh, wow, I'm not equipped for this, Or suddenly things about yourself, vices perhaps, anger, sadness, depression, they come up and you have to face them and barrel through them because guess what? In that solar eclipse in September, you're going to experience a whole new phase of you. You'll be beginning and starting over from square one once again. So, whether or not you're ready for it, it will challenge you. Now, in the case of Aries here, this solar eclipse at the end of the month is sort of prompting you to deal with loss. The 8th house is loss. It prompts us to move on from things. It prompts us to let go. So there's something perhaps that you've been holding on to since March of 2023 that's finally leaving your life. And the great thing about this is that it's going to indicate moving on into a new fuller expression of you and of relationships. During this phase, sometimes we have big breakups. Sometimes we meet new people. But whatever the case, as I said earlier, how we relate to ourselves will affect our relationships, and how we relate to other people will affect how we relate to ourselves. And then with Saturn going into Aries, it's going to be like you're tested on how well you moved on. Are you going to hold on to old hurts and guilt, right? Or are you going to be prepared to move on? Are you going to be prepared to be like, you know what? I may have screwed up, or someone else may have wronged me, but I'm willing to forgive myself and others in order to do better next time. Because all you do when you consume yourself with both regret, resentment, guilt, and all those sorts of emotions, you're holding on to hurt. You're holding on. And I know plenty about that. I'm Saturn girl. I'm the queen of resentment and holding on to hurt. So I have a little bit of authority to talk about this stuff, you know? Anyway, we got to move on to Libra Rising. So for Libra Rising, that means Saturn's been going through your 6th house. And you've just departed this first 7th house phase, just like our Aries Rising people. So I suggest you go back and watch the Aries Rising horoscope too, because this will affect you, okay? So all these subsequent signs, right? That is Libra, Scorpio, Sagittarius, Capricorn, Aquarius, and Pisces Rising. Please refer back to the previous segment of the opposite sign of your rising sign, because you'll get more hints there, okay? So for Libra Rising, we've just departed out of this major phase where our sense of self and how we relate to others goes through a major transformation. Now you're getting into the cocoon phase, right? Where you have to assimilate all those challenges, all those realizations, that sense of awareness, right? So the Saturn passing through Pisces for you in your 6th house may have brought up health challenges, conflicts with enemies, people that may attack you, people that are in open opposition to you in some way. But typically we also see our health, our bodily health, injuries and all that sort of thing, illnesses, and chronic illnesses coming up because it's Saturn. And Saturn there forces us to face those things. You see, when Saturn goes into the 6th house, it prompts us to do all the stuff that we didn't want to do. We probably let a whole lot of things just go by the wayside. We've been very irresponsible in life. We haven't been taking care of our obligations. And Saturn is a rude awakening here. Again, remember, waking up from a hangover, right? Now, the lunar eclipse that happened here back in September hopefully made you aware of a health issue that's been holding you back that you've been needing to address. Maybe it has to do with your coworkers. Maybe it has to do with your daily obligations. But something has been challenged by Saturn in that sector of life, and you've been having to face it. What this lunar eclipse last year should have shown you is what has been going on and what you have left by the wayside. And now hopefully you're addressing it. The lunar eclipse coming up in a few days in the opposite sign, Virgo, and your 12th house has to do with all the mental ramifications of that. The self-destructive behavior that perhaps precipitated the health crises. Or it could just be the self-destructive behavior you haven't been paying attention to. And now an event happens in your life that brings it up, and it's like, oh snap, I haven't been paying attention to that part of life. You may all of a sudden have to go into therapy, or you want to go into therapy. How about that? You have to face an addiction, or just a pattern of thwarting your own, of sabotaging yourself and thwarting your own success. So these are the things you're going to have to keep in mind, right? The solar eclipse that's about to happen in Aries in your 7th house is going to be the final transformation in how you relate to others. Yeah? This phase may bring a big breakup, as I said. Or this eclipse, rather. This eclipse at the end of March. It may also indicate meeting someone new. You could meet a new partner. And typically that also affects our sense of self, doesn't it? Because it's like, oh my gosh. Mm-hmm. See, when we meet new partners, they press buttons in us that we never knew we had. And it reveals parts of ourselves that only get revealed when we go through relationships. Now, when we get to that solar eclipse in Virgo at the end of September, you have to take great care, because this is going to be a difficult time on the one hand, because 12th house stuff sucks. Like I said, self-destructive behavior, self-sabotage, mental health, like yada, 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 depression. But this is a very optimistic thing because it's going to challenge and force you to clean up that area of life. You're going to experience a rebirth in your sense of mental health. Maybe you start getting into therapy then. Maybe you start to make real progress. Either way, though, this lunar eclipse is going to show you the way forward. Let's move on to Scorpio Rising. So for our Scorpio Rising friends, that means we're leaving the cocoon phase and we're entering the light of day phase, right? On the opposite side, right? Which we talked about earlier for our Taurus Rising friends, that it often indicates coming into a sense of enjoyment again, of optimism, of pleasure, of support, of meeting friends, getting connected with people and special interest groups or like-minded individuals, you know. So, leaving this phase should feel pretty good. The issue, though, is that the lunar eclipse back in September should have shown you that fun was lacking in your life. Because guess what? That's where Saturn has been. When Saturn's going through our 5th house, we often have persistent challenges with our children. Maybe they're going through a big thing. Sometimes there's issues with childbirth or pregnancy, all that sort of stuff. But typically what it is that we lose our ability to have fun. Oftentimes we're so stressed and spread so thin that we're just putting out lots of fires all the time. So the lunar eclipse, hopefully in September of last year, should have shown you where fun was severely lacking in your life. It's like, oh my God, I've just been sitting here stewing and depressed, just like rushing around all crazy style, you know? When what you need to do is stop and smell the... Well, I won't say what I was thinking. Let's just say flowers. Stop and smell the flowers. There's other many enjoyable things that you could smell too. But that's what it's about. It's about being present and not rushing off in your head either which way. Now, the lunar eclipse happening in a few days in Virgo, the opposite sign, indicates that things have been brewing up under the surface where people either have been like rejecting you or like losing interest in you or like, I'm not really into what they're producing anymore. I'm not into what they do, right? It might feel like you're being pushed out of groups, perhaps, that you've been in. You may be aware that groups you had been in previously just aren't serving you anymore. You know, maybe you don't agree with them. Maybe they're just assholes. I don't know. But this lunar eclipse is showing you that your previous connections need to disintegrate so that you can establish new ones after the solar eclipse that's going to happen at the end of September. Now, for more information about the eclipse phase that you're in, go back and watch the Taurus Rising segment, okay? Go back and watch the Taurus Rising segment because you'll get more indications there. Now, this final solar eclipse at the end of this month in your 6th house, this is going to indicate moving forward on a health issue or your daily work with a new sense of confidence. This is coming to completion, you see. This is the completion eclipse for your health, your injuries, illnesses, and enemies. And it could be very likely that it has to do with either having a new office space, finding a new job, finding a new routine, starting exercising, right? It could be health, exercise. I always say the 3 big ones are sleep, nutrition, and exercise. I'm saying that for myself too, because I've been skimping on the exercise part and the sleep part. Nutrition, I've been doing better. So just be aware that that's coming up for you, okay? With Saturn going into the 6th house, though, whatever new routine you decide on, whatever new helpful course you pursue, is going to be challenged by Saturn. There's going to be intervening circumstances that make a new diet, that make a new sleep habit, or that make nutrition difficult. because with Saturn in our 6th house, we have to do all the shit we didn't want to do previously. So it's like taking responsibility for your life. And that could continue stretching you a bit thin, right? And so you'll have to adapt to make healthy changes in your life. But anyway, let's move on to Snagimattarius Rising, right? Snagimattarius Rising homies. So for this eclipse phase, you've entered the 10th and 4th house phase, just like our Gemini Rising friends, right? And remember, this is probably the most important phase of your life, on the one hand, or one of the most important phases of your life. Excuse me. Excuse me. Or one of the most important phases of your life, rather. Because it changes our life direction on the one hand and our living situation on the other. Now, the previous phase had been all about making connections again and learning to enjoy yourself again. And this phase is about putting all those things into practice. Hopefully, with your renewed sense of optimism, you'll be able to see the changes a little bit better in terms of your life direction and your living situation. Because you see, you're starting to realize a new direction you want to go in. For our Sagittarius rising friends, Saturn's been going through the 4th house, which can strain relationships with parents. Sometimes our parents have health challenges that are coming up. You may have become aware of that at the lunar eclipse of last year, right? Of September. So it may have brought a challenging situation with your parents into focus. You may not have been aware of it before, and it's like, oh, shoot, that's going on. I have to address that. Or it could be your living situation. Something about your living situation had been coming to a close, and you're having to tie up all those loose ends to prepare for the next phase, right? Now, this lunar eclipse in just a few days in your 10th house indicates that something with your career and your life direction is coming to a close. It could be that you start looking for other jobs. Or maybe you just become aware that your current job is becoming intolerable. Or that you're doing something that's not in line with your values. You need to listen up here and pay attention to events, especially little ones, that start giving you little alarm clocks and signals around this time. You need to pay attention to those because they may indicate where you need to sort of move on. Now, it may be that you have to beef up your resume or you start looking around, but don't expect to see any major changes till after the solar eclipse in September of this year. The interesting thing, too, is that Aries is your 5th house, right? Aries is your... Now, this is also the rising sign of the United States. We're going to have to talk about this another time. But Aries is your 5th house. So the North Node there had been helping you to cultivate a sense of enjoyment and fun. But then Saturn will move into that house and be like, oh yeah, let's see how well you have fun with me, right? It's sort of like, you're playing video games in the library or whatever, enjoying yourself. And then the librarian comes up and says, that's not what that's for, right? Get off it. And all of a sudden, you have to sort of pretend to read and all that. Do all your homework assignments and try and steal away to watch, to play a couple games here and there. The big issue is that Saturn will test your resolve to have fun. Now, it could be also that you experience difficulties in childbirth or pregnancy or something like that, right? But for those of you who don't have children or who aren't conceiving or anything like that, it'll be a depressing transit, right? Where you sort of have to consciously fight to maintain a sense of enjoyment. Because remember, life without enjoyment is meaningless. Let's move on here. To Capricorn Rising. Now remember, Capricorn Rising, we talked about this eclipse phase when we looked at Cancer Rising, okay? So make sure you refer back to the Cancer Rising segment to get a sense of how else this will manifest for you, okay? However, for Capricorn Rising, we've had Saturn going through the 3rd house. And we're just departing from the 10th and 4th house phase. Remember, that's like the major manifestation phase, one of the biggest phases. And now we've entered into the 9th and 3rd house phase, which is all about reflection, putting things into perspective. Why is it that we do what we do, right? Our sense of value, what we believe, and why we believe it. Our worldview, our politics, our spirituality, our philosophy. And on the other hand, how we express that. Now, with Saturn going through the 3rd house, which I'm about to have, it feels like our voice is stifled, that we have to fight extra hard for people to listen. It feels like no one pays attention to what we're saying, right? I always think of Ariel in The Little Mermaid. I'm trying to sound like Sebastian the Crab, but I suck at impressions of that, But, remember when she loses her voice? Right? And that's what it feels like. It feels like no one's listening to us. We can't communicate. Now, sometimes even short distance travel is hampered. We might have a car breakdown. Oh, God, I don't need that right now. I don't need my car to break down. Please, please, please. But hopefully the lunar eclipse back in September of last year showed you that your current communication style wasn't working, that you weren't getting your message out. Perhaps you thought you were. Perhaps your voice had been stifled all along and you just didn't see it. That hopefully that lunar eclipse back in September showed you a new direction to move in, or at least showed you there was a problem and you have to start cultivating attention around it and addressing it. And you won't see your new voice emerge or a new mode of communication emerge until we get to that solar eclipse at the end of September, because that will represent a complete transformation in how you express yourself. And probably in the types of media you consume and your relationship to your community. This is all really important stuff. Now, the final solar eclipse in Aries will be in your 4th house, which will be the final segment of transformation having to do with your parents, your private life, and your living situation. Sometimes we become aware of our genealogy, our history we didn't know before. Oftentimes, we have to move, or our living situation does go through a big shakeup. Sometimes it's the final experience of a hardship with our parents, or maybe they experience a renewed sense of material security or health. Either way, this final hit is going to bring completion to the challenges you've been seeing with your parents or your living situation, right? Or your private life or genealogy, right? So there should be some hope and optimism around that. Saturn going in there, though, is like, well, let's see how well you did. It might feel like you're an alien in your own home. It may feel like your parents are strained from you in some way. And it might feel like your private life is tedious and full of stress. And maybe you don't even get any privacy. Suddenly you have people living with you or whatever. Your living situation becomes strained and perhaps a chore or depressing in some way. Could be, like I said, someone comes to live with you or whatever. But let's move on to Aquarius Rising. And this is me, right? I'm Aquarius Rising. Now, for us Aquarius Risings, we should really refer back to the segment about Leo Rising, because that will talk more about this phase we're moving into and what it means for us. So you see, we've been in the 9th and 3rd house phase of reflection. Like, how well did we do? and we start to think about moving on. Our value systems change, right? I know that did for me, right? My spiritual values totally changed. Now with Saturn going through our second house, it's sort of like our finances, our material resources, and our possessions, our business enterprises, our livelihood, how we earn money, was going through a difficult period, through a shakeup, right? I know for me, there was a sense of material scarcity, that I was bleeding money, that I wasn't earning what I needed to be earning. And I started my small business sort of under this, you know? And so it felt like it was all an uphill battle. Hopefully, the lunar eclipse back in September in Pisces showed us that we were bleeding money, and where we weren't being very responsible, and where we have to bring order in our lives. I know for me, it was, keeping track of business expenses and finances and all that sort of stuff. So, but the opposite lunar eclipse happening in just a few days in Virgo is going to bring a close on the other opposite area of life, right? Which for us is the 8th house, death, taxes, investment, other people's resources. So if you have any investments, this lunar eclipse is going to suddenly bring into view or focus the gains and losses from them. I'm really nervous about this because my retirement account has just lost a ton of money, right? Because of all the stupid stock market stuff. So I'm a little concerned about this one, but hopefully we start to see some positive movement as we get to September or following that September solar eclipse. It could be that a new return comes, right? You get a return on your investment. You get a gift or offering, right? You may get, it's a little late for this, but you may get a tax refund. You may have your debt written down, or clear out some debt, or consolidate your debt. It could also represent inheritance and even death, which, I don't want to put that out there. It's the most extreme case. But just be aware that all this is coming up. My guess is it's probably going to have to do with investments and taxes and your debt. So maybe you become painfully aware, God, I really hope not, that you owe a bunch of money for something. Or maybe you finally pay something off and you clear out some debt. I know I need to clear out some debt. So that's what I'm hoping for. Now, the final eclipse in Aries at the end of this month, March, is going to be the final form of your new communication style. This will represent the strength and foundation of your ability to communicate that Saturn is going to come in and challenge. Saturn's like, oh, right? You think you're a confident communicator? I know during this phase, my voice got really strong, like I felt like I found my voice. And then Saturn coming in here is going to be like, oh yeah? Let's see how you do. And I know I've been asked to testify at committee hearings and town halls about things. And I know that's probably going to represent a lot of resistance. And I'll have to face it in terms of communication. So just be aware that that's coming up. But of course, Aquarius Rising, refer back to Leo Rising for more information on this eclipse phase. But remember, it's the final phase. It represents death and taxes, right? So make sure that you get your financial situation squared away, because that can be the foundation of security that, prepares you to weather the coming storm. Now let's go to the final ones, right? Oops, went too far. Now this is Pisces Rising. And for Pisces Rising, please refer back to the Virgo segment, yeah? Because it'll talk more about this particular eclipse phase, which is identity and relationships, right? You come out of the 2nd and 8th house phase, which is death and taxes, yeah? And you've had to face the consequences of how you've managed your material resources. And now you're entering the phase where the emphasis is on your sense of self and how that relates to others. So the lunar eclipse back in September, right, should have shown you what Saturn's been stirring up this whole time and shaking up. When I went through this, I came out as transgender, and I also had to deal with chronic health issues and all that. Right? My POTS and yada yada. Degenerative disc disease, you know. And oftentimes, we become aware of our own mortality. We become a little bit more melancholy. We gain a sense of maturity while Saturn tours our first house. And what the lunar eclipse back in September should have shown you is that you haven't been addressing this. You know, perhaps there has been a health or body issue that you haven't been giving due attention. There could be a mental issue, right? Could have to do with your mind, your mode of thinking, but typically it's our sense of purpose, right? Which is our dharma, yeah? And not just our sense of purpose, but our sense of essence and what we think we are and who we think we are. Now, the solar eclipse in the lunar eclipse in the opposite sign, Virgo, in your 7th house, will show you where you might need to bring certain relationships to a close. It could be that a partner, a spouse, or whatever has been getting strained or dissatisfied with your relationship and you had no clue. And it could feel like they suddenly spring something on you, like, we need to talk. You know, instead of the state of the union, it's the state of the relationship. And it could engender some fear in you, right? Or it could be you who's let these sort of feelings of resentment build up under the surface, you see? Either way, the cracks in that relationship are going to become painfully aware. And you're going to have to address them between now and the end of September. The end of September, though, will indicate either the end of a relationship or the beginning of a new one. It could also be a complete change in how you engage relationships, right? In your relationship style, in your expectations, or what you want from a relationship. You see? So, now the final solar eclipse in Aries will be your 2nd house, right? And so you may have experienced a rebirth in how you make money, in your livelihood, your job, or maybe you even started a business. But Saturn coming in there is like, oh yeah, let's see how well you did there. And I can tell you from experience, Saturn in the 2nd house isn't very fun. Especially if, like, you're, you know, if you have your mind on your money and your money on your mind. You know. So just be aware of that. Okay? And the emphasis, as I said, will be on your sense of who you are and how that relates to others. Anyway, that was the final horoscope. I hope all that was useful. This was a very detailed set of horoscopes, okay? And please make use of them. Comment down below and let me know if you have any eclipse stories or if any of this was useful to you. And remember, the effects of eclipses continue on for the subsequent 6 months following that eclipse. So don't look for results right away. They will typically come on gradually over that period of time. Even though there may be climactic events within that duration of time, you're still going to have a prolonged sense of addressing the fallout from those events, you see? So please, I want to hear from you. I love you. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you for watching. Like this video and subscribe to my channel. And make sure to click the bell when you subscribe so that you get notified when my new videos drop. And I do the best readings. It's science. You can book through my website, saturngirl.org. And if you can't afford a reading right now, come to my live streams and get one for free. But you have to be subscribed to get notified about them. And please consider tipping me. It helps me make such wonderful content. You can give through super thanks below or become a member of my channel. And remember, I love you. You're beautiful. And have a wonderful, whatever it is you're having.